Nothing says fall on the Outer Banks like fresh oysters. You are making your own templates this time for this design by just using your number 3 round brush to kind of wiggle out a little outline that looks like an oyster shell. Then we're going to fill in, and I went dark. I started dark on the bottom layer and worked up to my lighter colors. And you may need to dry in between layers if your paints start to just blend and just become one color. I've added a little blue in this example, and there's a more in-depth video for you where I paint the oyster shells in real time, and I do a couple different styles to show you. And as I explained in that video, there's no real method except building layers. Just like the way the calcium builds up on the shell, when we start darker, we're going to give that illusion of those different layers over time building up on the shell. And your light's going to reflect into your bottom, through your paint to your bottom, your lighter paints to your bottom layer. It's going to give an illusion of depth. And the main piece is to put a little dent for the dent sort of for the hinge, and then you need that little black place where the muscle has been removed from the shell. And normally painting an oyster shell, we would use a darker background to make the light white shell stand out. But here we're going to be cutting these out, so go ahead and don't worry about leaving that dark outline to make it easy for you. And as an optional added touch, I have this amazing, glorious pearl metallic paint from Decor that I just love. And I think it really brought the whole shell up a notch by adding a little shimmer in places. And then you can do gold edges or you can leave them natural, entirely up to you. You could even use silver or copper if you like. Now, I encourage you to try painting the shells realistically, even if you're a little intimidated by it. But here's a little shortcut. If you're going to do the napkins, you don't need to take the time to paint the shell entirely. The main thing is we're going to go ahead, we're not going to use a white piece of paper under our napkin. We're going to take advantage of building some depth by adding some paint first. So I don't want you to be intimidated by the painting part. I definitely encourage you to try it. But if you are like me and you love colorful napkin oysters, I've got another option for you. And here I'm just adding the dark places on my oyster shell. If we used a white piece of paper, it would be fine, but why not add a little shadow to give the illusion of a real oyster shell underneath your napkin? It can stay white or gray because there's all different kinds of oyster shells. Make sure you remove both plies of your napkin. And you can see the effort that we put into painting our oyster shell first kind of gives us an idea of, it helps us see where we want to cut out our napkin. And you can cut your oyster shell out first and then glue your napkin and trim it on the back side if you want. But I cut mine out first all the way around and glued them on. I still ended up trimming the back side though. And remember, the napkins are a little more delicate than our scrapbook paper we normally use. And it's okay if the napkin gets a little wrinkled, because if you were filling in a concave shell, it would actually be a little wrinkled most likely. Of course, as always, this video is sped up to save you watching time, but plan to spend a good hour on your shells, not counting drying time. While your shells dry, you can start your background. I had the driftwood and cobblestone both on my brush at the same time. I just picked them up side by side and went all the way down the canvas. And so I'm already creating sort of a wood grain with this base coat. Once that's dry, it's time to dry brush. And dry brush is literally what it sounds like, a dry brush. Take most of your paint and get it off on your paper, and then just start to work it into your canvas. And keep in mind that you want to stay with the wood grain here. I added a little blue, green, teal color and some brown for wood to warm it up. Uneven is actually good in this situation. If you're nervous about adding knots on your beautifully dry brush background, you can always practice on paper first before you commit to your canvas. And it's going to look a little stark when you first get it on, but we're going to do a whitewash over the whole thing that's going to make it look more natural. I'm using very little pressure on my brush to keep the lines thin and a little more controlled, but don't sweat. This is not something that's going to be perfect, and you can just distribute it in a way that looks good to you. After that was dry, I have a lot of water on my brush with this white, so it looks like it's going to actually dry less white than it looks going on. You'll see here in a minute. And then I just added a couple of straight lines to be the slats, and I went ahead and made the middle a little bit wider, and I used a couple of lines sort of to simulate beadboard. You can flatten out your oyster shells by putting them in a book. We'll use our decoupage technique to glue our oysters down, glue on top, in the middle, and on the bottom. Now it's your turn. Be sure and post your oysters in the creative community. Happy making!